Wells Fargo CEO is defending the bank before hostile members of the House Financial Services Committee. The scandal shocked the nation, where it was revealed that the bank opened as many as 2 million fake accounts and fired over 5,000 workers since 2011. Tonight, we're going to speak with attorney Walid Tamari. He's a business and civil litigation attorney. Walid, welcome. How was this practice allowed to happen for so long?
Well, Danielle, that's the main question, because at the end of the day, what's so troubling about this case and this situation is that, the American public, the American consumers need to trust their banks. The American public, the American consumers need to trust the financial leaders of this country. And what's so troubling about this, Danielle, and all of these allegations surrounding Wells Fargo today is that, I think a lot of the public believed that after the 2008 financial crisis, that a lot of these measures were addressed to create increased transparency, increased accountability. So really, and particularly in terms of Wells Fargo had a reputation of really following a high ethical standard. So it's surprising and it's troubling to see these allegations around Wells Fargo today.
A lot of workers, of course, pinning the blame on a Wells Fargo pressure cooker culture and unrealistic sales goals set by top management. I want to point out one lawmaker. They compared the Wells Fargo scandal to Enron. Do you see any parallels there?
Well, so what happened to Enron is established, right? I think it's too early to tell what the end result is going to be with this Wells Fargo situation, right? Because the Department of Justice has just launched an investigation. The SEC is launching its own investigation. It's too early to tell. But at the end of the day, what's really important is that, clearly what happened with one of the things, for example, that's happening with some of these big major institutions that has allegations of really scandalous conduct is that they're going to face a bunch of lawsuits. They're going to face class action lawsuits, and they're going to end up facing Department of Justice investigations and possibly large fines. So it's a problem for Wells Fargo.
And of course, Enron was found guilty of massive financial fraud. Wells Fargo CEO John Strumpf faced a lot of backlash, really grilled yesterday. He was hoping to rebound from his appearance before the Senate, where Senator Elizabeth Warren told him he should resign. Strumpf has apologized. He told the House it was his recommendation for the board to take back his $41 million in stock awards and to forfeit a 2016 bonus and salary during the investigation. Is this enough, or should he take Warren's advice and resign?
Well, I'll tell you. So the pressure is really, really mounting on the Wells Fargo CEO. And so what's happened now? First of all, Wells Fargo's already paid $185 million to Los Angeles and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau as an initial measure of fines. Yesterday, as you mentioned, it was announced earlier this week, that the Wells Fargo CEO was foregoing $41 million in stock awards. And Carrie Tolstedt, who was the head of the retail banking division that oversaw the alleged fraudulent, the division where the alleged fraudulent conduct occurred, also agreed to give back $19 million in stock awards. And these are known, Danielle, as clawbacks. At the end of the day, the way I would look at this is these are certainly initial measures that are taken. In terms of what's sufficient and what's enough, I think that's going to result, and that's going to be a product of what the investigation shows and demonstrates.
And you mentioned, $41 million here, $19 million there. It sounds like a lot of money to the average American. But for those two individuals who bring in a lot of money, is that a lot of money for them to give up?
That's, Danielle, that is a great question. And so I think this goes to your initial question of where is this going to end up? What is the potential downside for Wells Fargo? So we've talked about all the class action lawsuits, right? The class action lawsuits that are going to come from their customers, right? The class action lawsuits that are going to come from their shareholders, and the class action lawsuits that have already come from their former employees. So you're dealing with three sets of class actions initially. But the Department of Justice investigation is something that really has to be taken seriously, because if you're talking about what can be expected in terms of fines and damages, in terms of what Wells Fargo has to pay, we have to keep in mind and only look at the recent settlement amounts that some of these large banks have ended up entering into the Department of Justice as a result of the 2008 mortgage fraud crisis. And Danielle, these settlement amounts have been in the billions of dollars. Even 2 weeks ago, the Department of Justice makes a $14 billion settlement demand against Deutsche Bank. Now, doesn't necessarily mean that's where the settlement is going to be, but we're talking regardless. We're talking about settlement amounts in the billions of dollars. So this is going to be really, I think that at the end of the day, this could be very meaningful in terms of a damages perspective for Wells Fargo.
And what do you think that means for other banks? Is this going to set some type of precedent? Is there going to be new laws that are made?
Well, again, and you're bringing up some really good points. At the end of the day, as I mentioned, one of the reasons why I think this was surprising to many is that Wells Fargo had the reputation of playing at a very high ethical standard. That was the reputation in the marketplace. So the question, I think now, since this has happened to Wells Fargo, I think the question really becomes, what's going to happen with these, what else is out there with these other banks? That's an important issue. And I think that the banks have to be very careful to make sure that, look, the standards that they have to operate by has to be very clear. It has to be a standard of transparency. And they have to be accountable. The banks and their executives have to be accountable for their conduct. And I think at the very least, hopefully a new standard will continue to evolve for accountability and for transparency.
And you bring up a good point there. I mean, it took so many years to discover this. What else is out there? You also mentioned 3 different lawsuits. There is another one, a separate action. Wells Fargo just agreed to pay $4 million to resolve a Justice Department investigation into improper seizures of vehicles owned by soldiers who fell behind on their loans. The CEO there, his leadership is sketchy at best. Do you think Strumpf is going to cut his losses? Do you think he's better off with a fresh start?
Well, and Danielle, the question that you ask in terms of cutting his losses is a really interesting question, because at the end of the day, what does cutting his losses mean? Does it mean for John Stumpf? Does it mean staying on as CEO longer than other people are urging? Or does it mean resigning? Right. I think where that ends up is really a product of where this investigation, keep in mind, this investigation is in its early stages. I mean, we've already talked about a lot of the developments so far, but those developments are only developments so far. It's early. Let's see what happens.
We'll see what else is out there. There may be a lot more that we haven't discovered. Representative Stephen Lynch cited allegations of this widespread fraud at Wells Fargo, as well as claims by former workers who said they were retaliated against after flagging fraudulent activity. Lynch suggested Wells Fargo be prosecuted under RICO. That statute has been applied against FIFA and the mafia. Do you think it applies in this case?
Well, again, this is early stages, and you don't know what the investigations are going to yield. You don't know what the complaints are going to yield. So you mentioned in terms of the workers, one of the workers have brought class actions already saying, look, what's happened here is that it was the functional equivalent of a wrongful termination, because in the allegations of the class actions that the workers brought, the former workers, I should say, is they basically make allegations that the environment that they had to work in was based on really unreasonable sales pressure. What's interesting about that, Danielle, is that actually flies in the face of what John Stumpf has been stating both in his testimony before Congress and before the Senate Banking Committee, where basically he said, look, there was no directive. What John Stumpf is maintaining is there was no directive from top senior level management for this type of conduct to take place. So again, how are we going to find out the truth of the allegations? I think it's an unfolding process that's going to only unfold after the facts and the investigations continue.
And to that point, a lot of critics are saying perhaps Wells Fargo was just too large to manage. Moving ahead, what do you think Wells Fargo should do to get things back up? running and get their reputation back and moving forward as a business, what do you think they should do?
Okay, so the words are T, capital R, capital U, capital S, capital T, trust. They have to figure out some way, okay, to make sure that the public and the consumers can trust Wells Fargo. Because if the consumers and if the customers can't trust their own bank, we've got problems, Danielle. So point number one, starting point number one, figure out whatever they need to do to make sure they gain back their customers' trust.
And is it even possible to recover at this point?
That's the question. That is the big question, right?
Wells Fargo CEO is forfeiting at least $41 million in pay, and he vows that his bank will drop its sales incentive program by the end of the week. But at Thursday's hearing before the House, nobody was impressed. Attorney Walid Tamari, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Have a good day. Thank you.